The note had no signature. It had appeared beneath the door of the small yellow bedchamber sometime in the hour before dusk, slipped through in a hand too careful to make a sound. Cecily Marsh found it when she rose to light the second candle, her foot nudging the folded paper against the floorboard. She picked it up the way she picked up most things these days, without expectation, the same way one lifts a spent coal from the grate. She read it twice. Leave before the wine is served, that was all. No salutation, no name at the foot. The letters were formed in the careful, compressed style of someone who had been educated well but had written little since, the ink slightly heavier at the end of each stroke, as though the hand had pressed harder in urgency. She folded the note along its original crease and held it at her side. Through the single window of the bedchamber, she could see the south lawn of Aldwych Park spreading toward the tree line, the late November light doing what late November light in England always did, turning the world the color of old bone. Below her, the household was already audible in its preparations. China rang distantly. Somewhere a door closed with the soft authority of a house staffed by people who had learned to manage sound. The dinner was at 7. The wine, served by the footman at approximately 20 minutes past the hour. Once the first courses were settled, and Lady Moorcroft had satisfied herself that the table arrangement met her precise requirements, would arrive at its usual time. Cecily knew this because she had been seated at that table for 6 evenings running now, in the chair at the far end nearest the servants' passage. The chair set slightly apart from its neighbors, as though placed there by mistake, rather than intention. She was the poor cousin. She was the woman with the ruined father and the sold house, and no prospects that would interest Lady Moorcroft's mathematical eye. To the family assembled at Aldwych Park for the fortnight's gathering, she was simply the difficulty no one had found an elegant way to mention aloud yet. She looked at the note again. Then she smoothed her gown, which was the blue serge she wore to every dinner because it was the most respectable thing she owned. And she went downstairs. She had not been the sort of woman to leave rooms early. She had never, before this past year, been the sort of woman to leave anything. The drawing room before dinner was where Cecily had learned the particular art of occupying space without drawing attention. She had perfected a kind of stillness at the window nearest the garden, from which she could observe the room's social machinery with the composed expression of someone who was merely resting her eyes. The candelabra were lit. The fire was high. Lady Moorcroft's eldest daughter, Arabella, held court near the pianoforte in the ivory silk that had been commissioned before the gathering began, its cost visible from across the room in the particular way that certain fabrics announce their own expense without vulgarity. Arabella Moorcroft had been spoken of since August as the appropriate match for the Earl of Aldwych. Cecily was not unaware of what this meant. The Earl of Aldwych had arrived on the second day of the gathering. Having been delayed from London by some matter, his secretary had refused to specify beyond the word parliamentary. He was 34, she had been told. Dark-haired. Reserved in a way that Lady Moorcroft characterized as appropriate dignity, and that the younger houseguests characterized, behind their fans, as rather cold. His name was Edmund Vane, and he had inherited the earldom at 26, under circumstances that no one at Aldwych Park discussed directly, though Cecily had noticed the way the older servants' faces closed when his name was mentioned in that particular connection. She had seen him twice in the 6 days she had been at the park. The first time, he had been crossing the east corridor with his steward at a pace that suggested he did not intend to stop, and he had not. The second time, he had stopped. She had been in the library at dawn, the library being the one room in the house where no one seemed to want her if no one required her, reading a volume of natural philosophy she had found behind a row of agricultural guides. The kind of book that suggests someone had once kept it there deliberately, away from the shelves where guests would look. She had been so engrossed that she had not heard the door, and when she finally registered the presence in the room, she had looked up to find the Earl of Aldwych standing at the far bookcase with a folded letter in one hand, his attention apparently on the middle distance. He had looked at her for a moment that went on longer than courtesy required. Then he had said, quietly, "Miss Marsh, the fire has gone out." And he had crossed to the hearth and restored it himself, which was not something earls did, and which no one else was present to observe. She had thanked him. He had said nothing further. He had taken the book he required and left. She had not been able to entirely account for it since. The drawing room before dinner was warm and bright and arranged to its best advantage, and Cecily stood at her customary window with her hands loose at her sides and thought about the note. "Miss Marsh." Lady Moorcroft had appeared at her elbow with the precision of a woman who had decided exactly where to position herself 3 steps in advance. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with the kind of settled confidence that comes not from cruelty, but from never having been required to doubt her own judgment. Her jewels were substantial. Her fan was made of carved ivory. "You look tired. The country air disagrees with some constitutions." "I am quite well, Lady Moorcroft. Thank you for your concern." "Of course." The fan moved in one slow, deliberate arc. "I hope you are not finding the evenings fatiguing. The gathering does tend toward length, and I am always mindful that our guests' situations vary in their," pausing briefly, "appetite for society." She was told this so often, and in so many variations, that Cecily had stopped noticing the precise shape of it. The tired cousin. The diminished guest. The difficulty no one mentioned aloud. The note burned quietly in her pocket. She could feel it against her hip as she murmured something appropriate and turned back toward the window. The dinner was laid at 7. Cecily took her usual chair at the far end and kept her eyes on her plate and tried to determine, without being obvious about it, where the note had come from. 17 people at the table, Lady Moorcroft at the head, Arabella at her mother's right, in the ivory silk, the Earl of Aldwych at the foot, at some remove from the nearest conversational cluster. In the particular stillness he seemed to carry with him everywhere he went, like a weather system of one. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at anyone with particular attention, which was, she had begun to understand, not the same thing as not noticing. The first courses arrived: the soup, the fish, a raised pie that the Moorcroft cook was evidently proud of. Lady Moorcroft managed the conversation at the upper end of the table with the efficiency of a woman conducting an orchestra she had personally assembled. At the lower end, Cecily spoke when spoken to, and otherwise watched the serving staff move in their practiced arcs around the table. She watched the footman lift the decanter. The wine was a deep garnet. The evening light caught it as he moved. She felt the note against her hip. She watched the wine reach the glass of the gentleman to her left, then the glass to her right. The footman paused at her shoulder, the decanter steady in his gloved hand, and Cecily looked down at her glass and then, very quietly, covered it with her palm. "Not this evening," she said. "Thank you." She did not look toward the foot of the table. She felt with a certainty she could not have justified that she was being observed. She understood after the soup was cleared that she was not the only one. The gentleman to her right was Mr. Aldous Finch, a Moorcroft cousin of the 3rd or 4th degree, with a pleasant face, and a moderate income and no particular consequence at this table. He was seated at the lower end, because the lower end was where consequence went to wait. He leaned toward her very slightly, under the cover of the table noise, and he said, low and rapid, "Miss Marsh, I am going to tell you something that you will pretend you have not heard from me." She looked at him. "There is a clause," he said, "in the arrangement Lady Moorcroft intends to present after dinner. I am not privy to its full particulars. I know only that it involves your father's house." She kept her face entirely still. "My father's house was sold 8 months ago." "It was sold, yes, to a creditor." He looked at his plate. "That creditor has since transferred the note to a second party. Lady Moorcroft has arranged, through the family solicitor, for that party to exercise the debt against you directly, rather than through the estate. What you will be presented with this evening is not a charitable offer. It will be presented as one." The noise of the table continued around them. Silver on porcelain? A burst of laughter from the upper end, Arabella's voice rising and falling with practiced ease. Cecily said nothing. She placed her fork very carefully parallel to the edge of her plate. "I have said more than I should," Mr. Finch said. He sat back. He spoke no further. The note had not warned her of this. If she had not stayed, she would not have known to steel herself for it. The note had told her to leave. Whoever had written it had perhaps been trying to spare her the precise information now sitting in her chest like a stone in cold water. Or perhaps, she thought, they had known she would not go. Perhaps that was the point. If you are wondering about whom I speak, you already know. You have known since the library at dawn. Stay with that knowing. The wine circulated. The courses were cleared. The conversation rose and fell in its predictable patterns, and Cecily sat at her end of the table and felt the shape of what was coming, with the specific clarity that comes when one has been preparing for a blow without knowing what form it would take. After dinner, the gentlemen withdrew, and the ladies followed Lady Moorcroft to the drawing-room in a procession that had the ceremonial quality of something that had been rehearsed. Arabella sat nearest the fire. The other ladies arranged themselves in their habitual orbits. Cecily took a chair near the window and set her hands in her lap and waited. Lady Moorcroft came to her at the 12-minute mark precisely. She sat down across from Cecily with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has prearranged the furniture in her mind. She folded her fan in her lap. She looked at Cecily with something that might have been called consideration if one were feeling generous. "Miss Marsh," she said, "I would speak plainly." "Please do." "Your situation, as I understand it, is not an easy one. Your father's affairs were not managed with," the fan moving once, "foresight. There are obligations outstanding that fall, in the current arrangement of the estate, to you. I am told the figure is in the region of £900. Cecily held her hands still in her lap. "Yes. I have, through some effort on the part of our family solicitor, obtained a certain influence over that obligation." Lady Moorcroft said this the way one might say that one had obtained a particularly fine carpet. "I am disposed to consider its resolution favorably, in the event that certain arrangements could be made." "What arrangements?" The fan opened again. Lady Moorcroft's voice smoothed itself into its warmest register, the register that sounded like kindness and functioned like a closing door. "There is a gentleman among our acquaintance, a Mr. Gerald Pow, who has expressed some interest in forming a connection. He is not young, it is true. He is established, however. The obligation would, in these circumstances, be resolved entirely." Cecily said nothing. "I think," Lady Moorcroft said, "that a woman in your position does well to consider what is available, rather than what might be desired." "A woman in my position," Cecily said. "Your father was unfortunate," Lady Moorcroft said, with the brisk gentleness of someone setting aside a lame horse. "The fact of it is simply what it is. Miss Marsh, I should not like to see you without a means of resolution. I am offering you one." Cecily looked at her hands. Gerald Pow was 61 years old, had buried 2 wives, and had a way of standing too close to whoever he addressed that Cecily had noticed on his arrival and filed away. She thought of her father's study, the smell of the books, the window that had looked out over the 3 acres of garden her mother had planted the year before she died, the garden that belonged now to someone she had never met. "I will consider it," she said. It was the answer that kept the door open. Lady Moorcroft, satisfied with this, inclined her head and withdrew. Cecily sat with her hands in her lap until the drawing room was full enough again that no one was watching her. Then she stood, quietly, and walked to the far end of the room where the small writing desk stood in the corner, and she picked up a piece of the house stationery, and she wrote a note. She left it tucked beneath the edge of the decanter on the side table nearest the door, where the servants would find it, and the guests would not. It was addressed to no one. It said only this: "I did not leave. I will not be leaving." Then she returned to her chair and sat with her hands folded and her back very straight, and thought about what she was willing to pay. When the gentleman returned, the Earl of Aldwych came through the doorway with the others and crossed directly to the window without speaking to anyone, and she watched him the way she watched most things, quietly, from the periphery, without expectation. He did not look at her immediately. Then he did. He looked at her in the particular way that she had been cataloging without meaning to, the quality of attention that was not a glance, but a rest, a brief settling of his gaze on her as though it had been drawn there by something other than politeness. His expression was unchanged, his jaw was level. There was something in the set of his eyes in that moment, some quality of weight, that she had not seen him direct at Arabella Moorcroft, or at the fire, or at the window he habitually occupied. He looked away. The conversation resumed its appointed routes. She held the note's crease between 2 fingers inside her pocket. "You knew I would stay," she thought. She could not be certain of this. She could only observe that she had stayed, and that this was the result of the staying, and draw no further conclusions. The evening concluded at 10. The household retired in its proper order. Cecily went upstairs ahead of the others at Lady Moorcroft's politely implied suggestion, which was the particular form of dismissal she had grown most accustomed to. She washed. She unpinned her hair. She sat at the small table in the yellow bedchamber and read until the candle reached its quarter. And then she put the book down and looked at the door. The second note arrived at precisely 10:30. She heard the faintest sound, the specific sound of a sheet of paper drawn along a floorboard, and her chest tightened in a way she did not allow herself to examine. She crossed to the door and picked up the note before she had decided to. It was the same hand, the same compressed, careful letters, heavier at the stroke ends. It said, "You stayed. Good. Come to the library at 8. I will not ask again." There was no signature. She stood at the door for a long time. Then she crossed back to the table, pressed the note flat on the surface, and set her hand on top of it, and thought about what it meant to be the kind of woman who did not leave rooms early. She decided that she was still that kind of woman. She went to the library at 8. The Earl of Aldwych was already there. He was standing at the hearth, with his back to the door, one hand on the mantel, looking into the fire with the expression of a man who has decided what he is going to say and has been waiting long enough that the decision has settled into his spine. He was in his morning coat, his cravat precisely arranged, his hair dark against the warm firelight. He did not turn immediately when she entered. He gave her a moment to collect herself, which was, she thought, either courtesy or calculation. Then he turned. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the drawing room the previous evening, the same quality of weight in his gaze, and he said, "You are aware of what Lady Moorcroft proposes. She told me last night. Did you accept it?" "I said I would consider it." He was quiet for a moment. The fire made its small sounds. Outside the library windows, the November morning was coming up pale and cold over the east lawn. "There is no arrangement of the debt," he said. "Pow does not have £900. He has the promise of £900, which Lady Moorcroft has offered him in exchange for his willingness to approach you. The debt itself is held by Moorcroft's solicitor and will be called unless you comply with what she has presented as a favor to you." She looked at him. "How do you know this?" "Because I paid the original creditor 6 weeks ago." The fire cracked. She heard it distinctly. She heard the beat of her own pulse in the strange, held silence that followed his words. "You paid," she said. "Your father's surveyor wrote to me in September. I had had some dealings with your father's estate, a matter of a boundary running along the Aldwych south edge, and the surveyor was not certain how to proceed and wrote to me as the adjacent party. I reviewed the obligation. It was, with a slight pause, not a difficult calculation." She thought of the note under the door. The note, written in that careful, compressed hand. She thought of the morning in the library when he had restored the fire and said nothing. She thought of the way his gaze rested, the specific quality of it. She thought of everything she had filed away and declined to name. "Why?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because," he said, "I went to dinner in September in a house 2 miles from your father's, and I watched a woman I did not know stand in a garden in the rain and argue with a solicitor's clerk for 20 minutes on behalf of a groundskeeper whose final wages had been misdirected. She did not win the argument. She did not shout. She simply did not leave until the clerk agreed to correct the figure." A pause. I asked the host who she was. He said nobody of consequence. "A merchant's daughter with a dead father and a sold house." He said it the way one mentions a detail that does not require retention. Cecily sat very still. He was incorrect, Edmund Vane said. She looked at her hands. They were quite composed. She was not certain what was happening in her chest, but her hands were entirely composed. "The note," she said. "I did not know what Lady Moorcroft intended until yesterday afternoon. When I understood, I thought you should be given the choice to leave before the shape of it became clear to you in front of others." He said this without apology, but also without the smoothness of someone who had rehearsed it. "I underestimated your preference. For staying. For knowing." She looked up at him. He had not moved from the hearthrug. He was standing with the same straight, still quality he always carried, his jaw set, his eyes on her with that settled weight that she had refused to name for 6 days. "The debt," she said, "is resolved. That is not conditional on anything. It is already done." She absorbed this. "Then what is this conversation?" He was quiet for a moment that felt very long and very deliberate. "This conversation," he said, "is separate from the debt. I wish to tell you myself what I had done and why, because you deserve to have the information plainly, and without it being tangled up with what I would prefer to ask you, which is a different matter entirely, and which I will not ask this morning if you would find it unwelcome. I am not placing an obligation on you. I am merely," with another pause, "ensuring that you are in possession of the full picture." She thought of her father's study, the garden her mother had planted, the sold house and the ruined estate, and the £900 and Gerald Pow standing too close. She thought of what it was to have been told, over and over, that she was a difficulty no one had found an elegant way to mention. She thought of a man she did not know, standing in a drawing room in December, watching her refuse a glass of wine. "Ask it," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, slight and controlled, the particular shift of a careful man who has been more careful than he intended, for longer than he intended, and who has found himself, in spite of every discipline, arrived somewhere he had not fully expected. "My ward," he said, "is 8 years old. She has been in my household for 2 years. She has not liked any of the women I have hired since I dismissed the last governess, which was 4 months ago. I have been told on good authority that this is not a difficulty of the child's making." A pause. "I have a mother who considers me obstinate. I have a household that manages itself. I have an estate that requires a particular kind of attention. I have given it for 8 years. I do not require a hostess for the season, or a political connection, or an advantageous alliance." She waited. "I require," he said, "a woman who will not be moved by social machinery, and who will tell a solicitor's clerk in the rain, without raising her voice, that a figure is incorrect, and wait until it is corrected." He held her gaze. "Miss Marsh, will you come to Aldwych?" She looked at him for a long moment. "That is not yet a question I can answer," she said. "You have given me no reason to trust you beyond what you have told me this morning, and what I have observed these past 6 days. I know. I do not know what you want beyond what you have described." He was quiet. "What do you want?" she said. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he looked at her, and the quality of it was different this time. Less measured, more direct. The weight of it reaching her in a way that landed somewhere below rational assessment. "I want," he said, "to have a reason to stop going to my own library at dawn alone. I want the ward in my household to have someone who looks at her the way you looked at that groundskeeper's wages. I want," with a shorter, quieter pause, "to not have spent 6 evenings watching someone cover her wine glass and wondering what she would do if she knew that I had been watching and drawing the same conclusion each time." He met her eyes. "That is what I want, Miss Marsh. I am aware that it is considerably more than I have a right to ask." She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the garden that had been her mother's, and was now no one's she knew. She thought about a note slipped under a door by a man who had thought she deserved the choice, even when he suspected she would not take it. She thought about the fire at the hearth this morning, already restored to warmth before she arrived, the room prepared for her the way a room is prepared for someone whose comfort has been decided upon in advance. "I would like," she said carefully, "to meet the child." Something in his face, very slight, shifted. "That can be arranged," he said. "And I would like," she said, "a week to consider what you have told me. Take whatever you require." She rose from the chair. He did not move to detain her. He stood at the hearth with his hands at his sides and watched her cross to the door. And she thought, without looking back, that she could feel the weight of his attention on her, like a hand almost at her shoulder, present and considered and restrained. She reached the door. "Lord Aldwych," she said. "Miss Marsh. The note last night, the second note." She did not turn. "You knew I would stay." A brief silence. "Yes," he said. She left the library and walked back through the east corridor and up the stairs to the yellow bedchamber, and she sat at the small table and opened the book she had not finished the night before, and found she could not read a word of it. She stayed at Aldwych Park for 3 more days. She spent the first morning in the east, drawing room working through a piece of Clementi on the pianoforte that had been left open at a passage marked in someone else's hand. She spent the first afternoon walking the south lawn, with a composure that she knew, without looking, was being observed from the study window on the second floor. She did not look up. She did not go inside early. On the second morning, Lady Moorcroft came to find her. "Miss Marsh," she said. She was in the small yellow sitting room. Fan in hand, the particular expression she wore when a calculation had been reviewed and found defective. "I understand that you have had some conversation with Lord Aldwych." "We have spoken, yes." "I hope," Lady Moorcroft said, with the careful control of someone walking very precisely over uncertain ground, "that you have not been given any impression that would lead you to," the fan moving once, "misread a gentleman's natural courtesy." Cecily looked at her. "Lady Moorcroft," she said, "I am not in the habit of misreading." Lady Moorcroft's fan closed. It was a very small motion, but it was, Cecily thought, the beginning of a fragmentation. "There are," Lady Moorcroft said, "arrangements at this gathering that have been in consideration for some time, arrangements of which you are perhaps not fully aware." "I am aware of your arrangement with Mr. Pow," Cecily said. "I am also aware of the nature of the debt and its current disposition." The fan remained closed. "I will not," Cecily said, "be accepting Mr. Pow's connection. And I think that you will find, when you speak to your solicitor, that the obligation is no longer available to you as a lever." She said this without triumph, without satisfaction, with only the precise level voice of someone who has decided that the figure is incorrect, and will wait until it is corrected. "I am grateful for the hospitality of the gathering. I intend to leave on Thursday." Lady Moorcroft looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, with the thin dignity of a woman who has encountered something her categories cannot measure, "I see." She withdrew. Cecily watched her go. She went to find Edmund Vane that afternoon in the East Garden, where she had been told by one of the housemaids that he walked at this hour when the weather permitted. She found him near the stone wall at the garden's boundary, a place where two properties had once been disputed, she supposed, and where the ownership of each stone had been calculated by men with more interest in stones than in the gardens that surrounded them. He turned when he heard her on the gravel. She said, "I should like to meet the child on Saturday, if that is convenient." He was still for a moment. Then something resolved in his face, quiet and complete. "It is convenient," he said. "And I should like you to tell me," she said, "about the man you were before whatever happened to make you this quiet." He looked at her for a moment, that went on long enough that she was aware of her own breathing, the particular awareness she had when he was near, the involuntary calibration of exactly how many feet of cold November air stood between them. "That will take longer than Saturday," he said. "Yes," she said. "It will." She held his gaze. He held hers. The November light was doing its particular thing to the garden, the color of old bone, and somewhere behind the stone wall a bird was making its small, insistent sound, and she was aware of his hands at his sides, entirely still, and of the specific quality of the silence he was holding. "Cecily?" he said. "Not Miss Marsh." Her name, quiet and direct, in the particular voice that had told her to sit down and had been telling her things she had been cataloging without naming all week. She felt it in the hollow of her throat. "On Saturday," she said. "On Saturday," he agreed. She went back to the house. She did not look back. She left on Thursday as she had said she would, with her box and her blue serge and the 2 notes in her pocket that she had decided to keep. She thanked Lady Moorcroft. She thanked the household. She thanked Mr. Finch, who pressed her hand and said nothing. She was collected by a carriage she had not arranged, which presented itself at the front steps at 10 o'clock, with a footman she did not recognize in a livery she recognized at once. She looked at it for a moment. Then she got in. The Aldwych ward was 7 years and 11 months old, and her name was Rosalind, and she had her guardian's eyes, and an entirely different manner of deploying them, which was to say directly and with complete expectation of response. She showed Cecily the nursery in approximately 4 minutes. She showed her the garden in approximately 12 minutes. She showed her the section of the library that she was permitted to access, which was 2 shelves of improving works that she had the particular expression of someone who had not found improving. And she looked at Cecily with a measuring directness and said, "Are you going to stay?" Cecily looked at her. "I am considering it," she said. Rosalind turned to the shelf and selected a volume and handed it to her. "This one is the least bad," she said. "If you are going to read to me, you should know which ones are worth it." Cecily opened the book. She read the first paragraph. It was, she had to admit, not entirely without merit. She looked up and found Rosalind watching her with the steady patience of a child who has learned to distinguish between people who were simply present and people who had actually arrived. Edmund Vane said nothing all morning. He was there, at the periphery of the nursery visit, and then at the edge of the garden, and then at the library door. He was learning, she thought, how to be in the same space as someone, and let the space itself carry the meaning of his being there. She did not know when he had learned this. She suspected he had been learning it for approximately 2 years and 11 months. At midday, she accepted a glass of wine. He sat across from her at the small table in the south breakfast room, which was the least formal room in the house, and had, she noticed, 2 worn chairs near the fire that had the look of chairs used regularly by people of significantly different heights, and she looked at the wine, and then at him. "I am not," she said, "good at being obliged to anyone." "I know," he said. "The debt," she said, "is not a debt," he said. It was a decision. It asked nothing in return and continues to ask nothing. If you decide in 6 months that you would rather be elsewhere, you will be elsewhere with the full resolution of your father's estate and without any claim on you by this household. She thought about this. "I do not want your charity," she said. "I know," he said again. "That is not what is being offered." She looked at her wine. The room was warm. The fire was high. The November light was outside the windows doing its usual work on the world, and she was inside, at a table with a warm glass and a chair that fit her, and a ward who had handed her a book with complete authority. And she thought about the note under the door. "Leave before the wine is served." She had not left. She had covered her glass and not left, and written a note to no one that said she was staying, and then she had gone to a library at 8 o'clock because a careful hand had told her to come, and she had decided, sitting in her yellow bedchamber with the candle at its quarter, that she was still the woman who did not leave rooms before they were finished. "I have a question," she said. He waited. "The first note," she said. "You told me to leave." "Yes." "And yet you wrote the second note asking me to come to the library." He was quiet. "You did not actually want me to leave," she said. He looked at her. The fire was quiet. The November morning was outside, and they were inside. "No," he said. He said it with the particular directness of a careful man who has arrived somewhere he did not fully expect, speaking plainly because he has run out of reasons for the care. "I did not want you to leave. I wanted you to have the choice. There is a difference." She held her wine glass. She thought about the garden her mother had planted, and the groundskeeper's wages, and the 2 notes in her pocket, and the 8-year-old who had handed her a book with complete expectation of a response, and she thought about what it was to be seen by someone who had noticed her in a garden in the rain, and had asked the host who she was, and had been told nobody of consequence, and had arrived at the opposite conclusion. "I will stay," she said, "until after Christmas. Then I will tell you what I have decided." He nodded once. "And," she said, "you will tell me about what happened, when you are ready. I am not asking you to hurry." He looked at the fire. The muscle at the edge of his jaw moved once. "There was a child," he said. "Before Rosalind, a son. He was 3. There was a fever in the winter of 1812. He stopped. He did not look at her, but he did not look away from the fire either. In the particular way of someone who has said a thing aloud in a room with another person, for what may be the first time. My wife did not survive it either. I was in London when both of them went. By the time I reached home, it was already over." The fire made its small sound. "Edmund," she said. "Not Lord Aldwych. His name. The way he had said hers in the garden, direct and without ceremony." He looked at her. She did not say anything else. She simply held his gaze and let him be in a room with another person who now knew and who was not going to leave, and who had asked him to hurry nothing. He looked back at the fire. After a long moment, he said, "I am not certain I know how to have company in the evenings. I am not certain I know how to be company," she said. "We may find that we manage." The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely anything. It was, she thought, a significant event. They sat by the fire for another hour. They did not discuss the debt or the gathering or Lady Moorcroft. He told her about the South Boundary dispute, which was more interesting than it sounded. She told him about the natural philosophy book she had found behind the agricultural guides, and he looked at her with something she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of startled, which expressed itself entirely in the stillness of his face and the quality of his attention. She stayed through Christmas. She was married in February in the small church on the Aldwych grounds, with Rosalind beside her in a white dress that Rosalind had selected herself on the grounds that she was the ward and it was her household, and she intended to be consulted on the matter of what people wore in it. The solicitor attended. Mr. Finch attended. Lady Moorcroft did not. Cecily wore the ivory silk that the Aldwych housekeeper had commissioned from the same house that had made Arabella Moorcroft's gown, which was, she thought, the neatest possible conclusion to that particular story. Edmund Vane did not make a speech. He held her hand at the altar with the stillness he brought to everything, and looked at her in the way she had been cataloguing since a morning in a library in November. And she looked back at him and thought, simply, here. The south breakfast room in the evenings was hers now, the worn chairs by the fire and the wine on the side table, and Rosalind asleep upstairs with a book she had selected on good authority. The portrait of Edmund's wife was still in the gallery, turned slightly toward the wall as it had been when Cecily arrived, and in the spring she asked him if he would like it somewhere else, and he said yes, and they moved it to the morning room where the light was better, and they stood looking at it for a while together. Two people who had both learned how to be in a room with a loss that was not going away and which did not require going away, only the particular dignity of being acknowledged by someone who would stay. She kept the notes. She kept them in the small drawer of the writing desk that had once been in the yellow bedchamber and was now in the room that she used as her own sitting room, the room that looked out over the east lawn, the room where the morning light came in first. In the evenings, when Rosalind had gone upstairs and the fire was settled and the wine was poured and the house was quiet around them, Edmund Vane would sometimes come and stand in the doorway of that room rather than calling to her, and she would look up from whatever she was reading And she would find him there. And he would not say anything. And she would not say anything. And then he would cross the room and sit in the chair across from hers. And that was the shape of the evenings now. He had learned to have company. She had learned to be it. Outside in February there had been snow. In March there was not. The east lawn went from white to brown to the first tentative suggestion of something else, and Rosalind, who had the ward's particular authority in matters of the garden, declared that they would plant something in the south corner that her guardian had neglected, and she required to know what had grown in Cecily's mother's garden. And Cecily told her, and Rosalind wrote it down with the complete confidence of someone who has decided the matter. The corner was planted in April. In the evenings, in the sitting room with the east window and the fire, and the worn chairs and the wine and the man across from her, who had once written 2 notes in a careful hand, and had not, even once, asked her to leave before she was ready, Cecily sometimes took out the smaller of the 2 notes and held it. Leave before the wine is served. She had not. She would not have. If you stayed this long with Cecily, leave your thoughts below. She earned it. And so did you. The chair was warm, the fire was quiet. Outside the east window, the April evening was doing what April evenings in England do, which is to make the world look, for a few minutes, precisely the color of a beginning. She put the note back in the drawer. She picked up her book. She stayed.